Let me ask you something. Do the Asian people you know feel supported and welcomed at work? How do you know if they do? If you identify as Asian, do you feel supported and welcomed at work? For most of my professional career, I've been the only or one of the only Asian people in any given team or department. I've had largely positive work experiences, but there have been times where I didn't feel seen or supported, and sometimes I have experienced outright racism at work. Like many people, Asian and non-Asian alike, I didn't have any training in common experiences that Asian communities face at work. I didn't have the language to describe some of the stereotypes, and I didn't have the strategies to do something to make it better for myself and people like me. So, I've spent the last decade asking questions, staying curious, and listening to people's lived experiences, and I've learned a ton along the way. I know this can be daunting, but you've taken the first step and you're here now. One of my favorite things is doing talks and workshops that focus on Asian identity and experience. To better support Asian employees, we'll explore who even falls under this category. We'll walk through common things they might experience at work, and we'll learn how you can play a part, regardless of your role, in creating more inclusive and welcoming workplaces. I've also provided a resource guide in the exercise files to help you on your learning journey. Now, more than ever, whatever your identity, we all have a role to play in being aware of anti-Asian hate and understanding the workplace experiences of your Asian colleagues. You have the power to make positive change. Will you use it? Have you ever noticed that sometimes when you're talking to someone who's describing a person from a minoritized group, there's this awkward pause while they're trying to figure out how they want to say it? Oh, my new colleague, she's Asian. She's from Korea. This sometimes happens in conversations about identity, especially racial and ethnic identity, because we don't want to say the wrong thing. We want to make sure we're being respectful with our language, but sometimes we also aren't sure what the correct language is. And there are often many societal hang-ups and taboos around even talking about race and identity to begin with. So many of us don't have a lot of practice with using terminology accurately, fluently, and comfortably. I've been there, and I've also learned some helpful notes along the way. So let's get into some important terminology related to Asian employees. In this course, I'll often use terms like Asian people or Asian employees to signify this racial group. When appropriate, I'll use more specific language. Asia is a large, diverse place, and people from different parts of the continent have different experiences. So I might say South Asian, East Asian, Southeast Asian, or Western Asian. Some Asian employees, particularly more recent Asian immigrants and those who live and work in Asia, might feel conflicted about using this label. About 60% of the world's population would be considered Asian, and there's tremendous diversity within that population. Nepal and Japan, for example, are more than 3,000 miles apart. While there are some cultural similarities between these two places, there are also plenty of differences. It can be kind of confusing to think of all these people being categorized under the same label. These conversations were top of mind for student activists Emma G. and Yuji Ichioka in Berkeley, California in 1968. They're widely credited with the first public use of the term Asian American. They and other students of Asian descent knew that, in spite of differences and sometimes centuries-long conflict between their home nations, there was something really similar about how they were treated in the United States. In the words of another student activist, Gordon Lee, this new identity arose out of our common experiences in America, the experience of being treated as if we were all the same and of an inferior race. As a result, the differences in our home countries became less important, and we were able to find a common interest and identity with each other. So, Asian American became a political identity aimed at harnessing collective power. Many Asian employees will identify themselves both by a broader political term like this and by a more specific ethnic identity. For example, I'm really proud to say that I am Asian American because through that shared identity, I feel solidarity and collective power. And I'm also very proud to call myself Malaysian Chinese, which is closer to how I personally identify, which tells you more about my specific family experiences, histories, and so on. This course is centered in the US context, though the concepts are applicable to many other places, particularly similar white majority English-speaking countries like Canada, the UK, and Australia. For that reason, I'll use Asian more often than Asian American, but there's one more term I want to cover. You'll sometimes hear terms like Asian Pacific Islander or the acronym API. This is an even more expansive identity group that includes people from Pacific Islands like Samoa, Fiji, and Hawaii. In many cases, this is a useful, inclusive term, particularly as Pacific Islander invisibility at work is a real issue. But in other cases, this term can cause problems. When we use the term API, but we really mean Asian, and we don't consider or center the voices and needs of Pacific Islanders, we are exacerbating that invisibility. So because this course does not explicitly address Pacific Islander identities and experiences, I'm rarely going to use the term API here, but I want you to know it. The more that you understand what different terms mean, the more likely you are to practice and become comfortable using them, and the more others will feel encouraged to do the same. And using accurate language to talk about human difference is a good thing. It sends the message that difference isn't bad, but something you accept and enjoy, and that helps to create more welcoming workplaces. Ask yourself if you've ever heard the following stereotypes. Asians are all hardworking. Asians are naturally good at math, science, and technology. Asians are well-behaved and don't cause trouble. These are just some of the components of the model minority myth, a broader stereotype that typifies Asian people as a desirable minoritized group. You've almost certainly heard most or all of these stereotypical beliefs before, whether you recognized it or not. They're all over film and television. You might even believe these things yourself. After all, on the surface, these are all good things. And when you think about previous stereotypes about Asian people and policies that upheld those older stereotypes, like the Chinese Exclusion Act or Japanese internment during the Second World War, isn't it a positive change to now be portrayed as model citizens? Well, there are many problems with the model minority myth, and I'll cover just a few here. First, like all stereotypes, the model minority myth ignores individual difference. I had an Asian colleague once who was outspoken about workplace culture issues. Our manager came to me to intervene, saying, "That person doesn't understand their own racial identity." The implication was, they're Asian, so they should be quiet and know their place, right? My colleague's valid concerns were dismissed because she didn't match our manager's mental models for how an Asian person should show up at work. More broadly, the model minority myth ignores group differences. This myth is centered mostly on people from some East and South Asian countries. Since the 1960s, United States immigration laws have put a strong preference on Asian people from certain places with certain skills and education backgrounds. So we've been bringing in Asian people who match the profile of the model minority, and this stereotype starts to perpetuate generationally. But it ignores the fact that there are plenty of other Asian people who don't come from highly educated, highly skilled backgrounds, including plenty of Asian communities who came as refugees, and nearly 2 million undocumented people of Asian origin in the United States. The struggles that other groups experience can get lost if we think of all Asians as inherently successful. The stereotype is also used against people of other racial and ethnic backgrounds. Have you ever heard the logic, well, the Asians are doing well, so why can't this other group? Remember, that perception of Asian success is based on an incomplete picture that is sometimes made real by immigration practices. In fact, one of the reasons the model minority myth has been so enduring is its usefulness in justifying racism and stereotypes against other racial groups. Disrupting the model minority myth doesn't just help Asian employees, it helps people from all minoritized backgrounds. Finally, the model minority myth obscures older stereotypes about Asian people that also still hold power. One of these is known as the perpetual foreigner stereotype. This is the belief that Asian people do not fully belong here or are outsiders. This belief is applied even to Asian people who were born in the US, are American citizens, or even have been here for multiple generations. A recent survey found that 20% of Americans agree or completely agree that Asian Americans are more loyal to their country of origin than to the US. And if you're an Asian person in any non-Asian country, it doesn't matter how many generations your family has been there, you've almost certainly heard a version of, "But where are you from originally?" See, the model minority myth has the word minority in its name. In other words, you might be the model, but you are always and forever not quite belonging. So this model minority myth leads people to see Asians as interchangeable and not quite three-dimensional humans with complicated histories, stories, emotions, and aspirations. Recognizing that this myth is pervasive in the workplace is a critical step towards better understanding Asian employee experiences and creating more supportive environments.